What if I told you that Iceland is pumping millions of tons of carbon dioxide directly into the ground, and instead of causing an environmental disaster, it's actually solving climate change? It sounds like science fiction, right? Well, Iceland has been doing exactly this for over a decade, and the result after 10 years has stunned the entire scientific community. This is that incredible story. But to understand why Iceland would attempt such a seemingly impossible feat, we need to go back to 2008. That year, the world was gripped by two major crises. The first was the global financial meltdown that devastated economies worldwide. The second was the growing realization that climate change wasn't some distant future threat, but an immediate crisis requiring unprecedented action. Iceland, a small island nation of just 350,000 people, found itself at the center of both storms. The banking collapse had crushed the country's economy, leaving it desperate for new industries and revenue streams. But Iceland also possessed something that made it uniquely positioned to tackle one of humanity's greatest challenges. The country sits on one of the most geologically active regions on Earth, powered by massive geothermal energy systems, and surrounded by volcanic rock formations that had been quietly storing carbon for millions of years. Picture this. Iceland generates nearly 100% of its electricity from renewable sources, primarily geothermal and hydroelectric power. The country literally sits on top of a volcanic hotspot where the North American and Eurasian tectonic plates are pulling apart. This creates not just abundant clean energy, but also geological conditions that exist almost nowhere else on the planet. What most people didn't realize was that this same volcanic activity had been naturally capturing and storing carbon dioxide for millennia. The numbers surrounding climate change in 2008 were absolutely staggering. Global CO2 emissions had reached 36 billion tons per year and were climbing rapidly. Scientists warned that atmospheric CO2 levels needed to not just stop rising, but actually decrease dramatically to avoid catastrophic climate change. The problem was that most proposed solutions focused on reducing future emissions, but did nothing about the trillions of tons of CO2 already in the atmosphere. Traditional carbon capture technology existed, but it faced massive problems. Most systems could capture CO2 from industrial sources, but then what? The gas had to be transported, often thousands of miles, to suitable storage sites. Even then, there was no guarantee the CO2 would stay underground permanently. Geological surveys showed that traditional storage in depleted oil fields or deep saline aquifers could leak, potentially releasing all that captured carbon back into the atmosphere decades or centuries later. For years, Iceland's scientists and engineers had been quietly observing something remarkable happening beneath their feet. The country's volcanic rocks, particularly basalt formations, seemed to naturally interact with CO2 in ways that other rock types couldn't. When CO2 came into contact with basalt in the presence of water, it didn't just get stored temporarily, it actually transformed into solid rock through a process called mineralization. But here's what made the situation even more desperate. By 2014, atmospheric CO2 levels had reached 400 parts per million, the highest in over 3 million years. Climate scientists were running out of time to propose solutions that could work at the massive scale required. Most renewable energy technologies, while crucial, would take decades to fully replace fossil fuels. Even the most aggressive emission reduction scenarios wouldn't be enough to prevent dangerous climate change without some way to actively remove CO2 that was already in the atmosphere. The Icelandic energy company Reykjavik Energy, working with the geothermal power plant at Hellisheidi, decided to attempt something that many experts considered impossible. Instead of just reducing emissions, they would actively remove CO2 from the atmosphere and permanently lock it away in volcanic rock. The scale they envisioned was unprecedented. Not just thousands of tons, but eventually millions of tons of CO2 per year. But this wasn't just about technology. It was about proving that a small nation could develop solutions that the entire world desperately needed. Iceland had already transformed itself from one of Europe's poorest countries to one of its most prosperous through innovative use of its natural resources. Now, they were betting they could do the same thing for the planet's climate. the challenge seemed insurmountable. How do you capture millions of tons of invisible gas from the atmosphere and turn it into solid rock? How do you do it safely, without causing earthquakes or groundwater contamination? And how do you make it economically viable when traditional carbon capture was still prohibitively expensive? These weren't just technical questions. They were the kind of fundamental scientific and engineering challenges that had stumped researchers for decades. Critics pointed out that Iceland's unique geology couldn't be replicated anywhere else. Skeptics argued that even if the technology worked, it could never scale to the billions of tons of CO2 removal that climate change demanded. The International Energy Agency estimated that carbon removal technologies would need to capture 10 billion tons of CO2 per year by 2050 to keep global warming below dangerous levels. Iceland's experiment, even if successful, seemed like a drop in the ocean. Environmental activists were divided. Some saw it as a dangerous distraction from the urgent need to stop fossil fuel emissions immediately. Others worried that carbon capture technology would become an excuse for continued pollution, allowing oil companies and governments to delay the transition to renewable energy. There were also concerns about unintended consequences. What if pumping massive amounts of CO2 underground triggered volcanic eruptions or earthquakes? What if the technology failed catastrophically, releasing all that stored carbon at once? But Iceland's scientists had a different vision. Dr. Sigurdur Gíslason at the University of Iceland had been studying the interaction between CO2 and basalt rock for over a decade. His research suggested that the mineralization process wasn't just possible, but could happen much faster than anyone had imagined. While traditional geological storage relied on physical trapping of CO2 gas, Iceland's approach would chemically transform the carbon dioxide into carbonate minerals that were thermodynamically stable for millions of years. The project, called CarbFix, officially launched in 2014 with an investment of $50 million. The concept was elegantly simple in theory, but incredibly complex in execution. CO2 would be captured directly from the atmosphere or from industrial sources, dissolved in water, and injected into basalt rock formations deep underground. The dissolved CO2 would react with minerals in the basalt to form solid carbonate compounds, permanently locking the carbon away. Construction of the CarbFix facility began in earnest in 2015, and it quickly became clear that this wasn't just another research project. The engineering challenges were unlike anything attempted before. The team had to design systems that could capture CO2 directly from the ambient air, compress it, dissolve it in water, and inject the resulting mixture into specific rock formations 400 to 800 meters underground. The site chosen for the experiment was next to the Hellisheidi geothermal power plant, about 25 kilometers east of Reykjavik. This location was ideal for several reasons. The power plant provided both the renewable energy needed to run the carbon capture equipment and a concentrated source of CO2 from its geothermal operations. More importantly, the area sat on top of massive basalt formations that extended deep underground. But the early years were filled with setbacks and doubts. The first challenge was developing technology that could efficiently capture CO2 from the atmosphere. Atmospheric CO2 concentrations are only about 400 parts per million, meaning that capturing significant quantities requires processing enormous volumes of air. The team partnered with Swiss company Climeworks to develop direct air capture units that use specialized filter materials to extract CO2 from ambient air. These machines, resembling giant industrial fans, had to run continuously to capture meaningful amounts of CO2. Each unit could process about 50 tons of CO2 per year, but the CarbFix project aimed to eventually capture thousands of tons annually. The energy requirements were enormous. Critics pointed out that the electricity needed to run the capture equipment could offset much of the climate benefit, especially if that electricity came from fossil fuel sources. Fortunately, Iceland's abundant geothermal energy solved this problem. The Hellisheidi plant generates far more electricity than the local grid can use, particularly during off-peak hours. This excess renewable energy could power the carbon capture equipment without displacing other clean energy uses. But even with free renewable electricity, the economics remained challenging. The next hurdle was the injection process itself. Dissolving CO2 in water and injecting it underground sounds straightforward, but the reality was far more complex. The CO2 water mixture had to be injected at precise pressures and temperatures to ensure it reached the right rock formations. Too much pressure could cause fractures that might allow the CO2 to escape. Too little pressure and the mixture wouldn't penetrate deeply enough into the basalt. Geological surveys had to map the underground rock formations in unprecedented detail. The team used seismic imaging, similar to the technology used to find oil deposits, to identify the best injection sites. They discovered that the basalt beneath Hellisheide was perfect for their purposes. Porous enough to allow the CO2 water mixture to spread through the rock, but stable enough to contain it safely. The first major test came in 2016 when CarbFix began injecting 230 tons of CO2 into a test well. The team had predicted that mineralization would take 25 to 50 years based on previous laboratory studies. Instead, something extraordinary happened. When they tested the injection site just 2 years later, they found that over 95% of the injected CO2 had already transformed into solid carbonate minerals. This result defied scientific expectations. Laboratory experiments had suggested that the mineralization process would be extremely slow under natural conditions. The CarbFix team had discovered that the unique combination of Iceland's basalt chemistry, groundwater composition, and geological conditions accelerated the process by more than a decade. Dr. Georg Matter from the University of Southampton, one of the project's lead scientists, described the results as absolutely remarkable. The team published their findings in the journal Science, demonstrating that rapid mineralization was not just possible, but reproducible. They had proven that CO2 could be permanently stored as rock in a time frame that made the technology practically useful for climate change mitigation. But success brought new challenges. If the technology worked so well, how could it be scaled up to handle the massive amounts of CO2 removal that climate scientists deemed necessary? The original CarbFix facility could handle only about 4,000 tons of CO2 per year, a tiny fraction of what would be needed to make a meaningful impact on global emissions. The team began planning CarbFix 2, an expanded facility that would capture 36,000 tons of CO2 annually. This required building much larger direct air capture units and developing more sophisticated injection systems. The new facility would need multiple injection wells to handle the increased volume, along with extensive monitoring systems to track the underground mineralization process. Public reaction to the early results was mixed. Environmental scientists were cautiously optimistic, but many remained skeptical about the technology's potential for global deployment. The main criticism was geographic limitation. Basalt rock formations suitable for rapid mineralization exist in only a few places worldwide, primarily in Iceland, parts of India, and the northwestern United States. However, geological surveys soon revealed that suitable basalt formations were more common than initially thought. The Columbia River basalt group in the Pacific Northwest, the Deccan Traps in India, and similar formations in other countries could potentially support CarbFix-style operations. These discoveries suggested that the technology might be scalable to other regions with the right geological conditions. More importantly, the success of CarbFix began attracting international attention and investment. The European Union provided additional funding for expansion, recognizing the project as a potential breakthrough in carbon removal technology. Private investors, including major oil companies looking to offset their emissions, began expressing serious interest in the technology. The oil industry's involvement was particularly significant. Companies like Shell, ExxonMobil, and Total had been investing in traditional carbon capture and storage for years, but with limited success. The permanent mineralization demonstrated by CarbFix offered something that conventional storage couldn't: absolute certainty that captured CO2 would never leak back into the atmosphere. By 2018, the CarbFix project had demonstrated successful operation for over 3 years and had begun sharing its technology with international partners. Pilot projects were planned for other countries with suitable geology, including the United States, where the Pacific Northwest National Laboratory began adapting CarbFix techniques for the Columbia River basalt group. But perhaps the most significant development was the growing recognition that carbon removal, not just emission reduction, would be essential for meeting global climate goals. The success also sparked intense research into improving the technology's efficiency and reducing its costs. Teams around the world began studying how to optimize the mineralization process, develop better direct air capture systems, and identify new geological formations suitable for CO2 storage. What had started as Iceland's unique experiment was becoming a global research priority. Critics continued to point out limitations. The energy requirements for direct air capture remained substantial. Even with renewable electricity, the costs were still much higher than simply reducing emissions through renewable energy deployment. And questions remained about whether the technology could truly scale to the gigaton levels that climate change mitigation would require. Nevertheless, by 2019, CarbFix had achieved something that many thought impossible. It had demonstrated a technology that could permanently remove CO2 from the atmosphere and lock it away as solid rock. The project had captured and mineralized over 10,000 tons of CO2, proving that the concept could work reliably at industrial scales. What happened over the next 5 years defied all predictions and transformed global thinking about carbon removal. The CarbFix technology didn't just work, it exceeded every performance target the scientists had set. By 2024, the expanded facility was capturing and permanently storing 36,000 tons of CO2 per year, making it the world's largest direct air capture and storage operation. But the numbers tell only part of the story. The real breakthrough came from unexpected improvements in the technology itself. The team discovered that by carefully adjusting the pH and mineral content of the injection water, they could accelerate the mineralization process even further. Instead of 2 years, over 85% of injected CO2 was transforming into solid rock within just 6 months. This acceleration had profound implications for the technology's scalability. Faster mineralization meant that injection sites could handle much higher volumes of CO2 without the risk of saturation. The same underground formations that the team had initially thought could store thousands of tons were actually capable of storing tens of thousands of tons without any geological stress or instability. Dr. Edda Aradottir, who became the project director in 2020, described the results as beyond our wildest optimism. The team had proven that not only could they permanently remove CO2 from the atmosphere, but they could do it at a rate and scale that made economic sense. The cost per ton of captured and stored CO2 had dropped from over $600 in the early trials to less than $200 by 2024. Even more remarkably, monitoring systems showed absolutely no leakage of stored CO2. Traditional geological storage projects typically expect some percentage of injected CO2 to eventually escape back to the surface. But the mineralization process created carbonate compounds that were chemically identical to natural limestone, rocks that had remained stable for hundreds of millions of years. The success attracted massive international investment. Microsoft, which had committed to removing all the carbon it had ever emitted by 2030, signed a contract to purchase carbon removal credits from CarbFix. Amazon, Google, and other tech giants followed suit, creating a market for permanent carbon removal that reached billions of dollars in value. More importantly, governments around the world began taking notice. The United States Department of Energy invested $3.5 billion in developing similar facilities across the American Northwest. The European Union launched the CarbFix initiative, funding 12 pilot projects across member countries with suitable geology. Even developing nations with significant basalt formations, including Ethiopia and Argentina, began exploring how they might adapt the technology. China's involvement was particularly significant. Despite being the world's largest emitter of CO2, China also possessed extensive basalt formations in its northwestern provinces. Chinese scientists partnered with the CarbFix team to develop the first large-scale facility outside of Iceland. The pilot project in Xinjiang province aimed to capture 100,000 tons of CO2 per year, nearly 3 times the capacity of the original Iceland facility. But perhaps the most extraordinary development was the emergence of enhanced mineralization techniques. Researchers discovered that adding certain catalysts to the injection water could accelerate the rock formation process even further. Some experiments achieved 90% mineralization within just 90 days, opening the possibility of truly massive CO2 storage operations. The oil industry's response was equally dramatic. Companies that had spent decades extracting carbon from the ground suddenly found themselves racing to put it back. Shell announced a $10 billion investment in carbon removal technologies, with CarbFix-style mineralization as the centerpiece. ExxonMobil acquired exclusive licensing rights to deploy the technology across its global operations, aiming to offset 500 million tons of CO2 emissions by 2035. This corporate involvement sparked controversy among environmental activists. Critics argued that carbon removal technology was allowing fossil fuel companies to continue polluting while claiming to be carbon neutral. They worried that massive investments in carbon capture would delay the transition to renewable energy and electric vehicles. However, climate scientists increasingly argued that both approaches were necessary. Dr. Michael Mann from Penn State University, initially skeptical of carbon removal technologies, acknowledged that we're at the point where we need every tool available. We must reduce emissions as fast as possible, but we also need to remove CO2 that's already in the atmosphere. The IPCC's 2023 report reflected this new reality. For the first time, the organization's climate scenarios included substantial reliance on carbon removal technologies. Independent economic analyses began showing that carbon removal could become a major industry. McKinsey & Company estimated that the global carbon removal market could reach $1.2 trillion annually by 2050. Iceland, with its pioneering role in the technology, was positioned to become a major exporter of both carbon removal services and technical expertise. The geopolitical implications were equally significant. Countries with suitable geology for mineralization found themselves in possession of a new type of natural resource: underground carbon storage capacity. This geological advantage could become as economically valuable as oil reserves, but for removing carbon instead of adding it. International climate negotiations began incorporating carbon removal targets alongside emission reduction commitments. The concept of net negative emissions, removing more CO2 than a country produced, shifted from theoretical possibility to policy objective. Several nations, including Iceland, Denmark, and Costa Rica, announced goals to achieve net negative emissions by 2040. The technology also sparked innovations in related fields. Companies developed more efficient direct air capture systems specifically designed to work with mineralization storage. Others focused on optimizing the chemistry of the injection process to achieve faster and more complete rock formation. The result was a rapidly evolving ecosystem of carbon removal technologies. By 2024, over 50 CarbFix-style facilities were operating or under construction worldwide. The total capacity exceeded 2 million tons of CO2 per year, making permanent carbon removal a measurable contributor to global climate efforts. While still small compared to global emissions of 36 billion tons annually, the exponential growth trajectory suggested much larger impacts in the coming decade. Perhaps most importantly, the success of CarbFix had proven that seemingly impossible climate solutions could become reality with sufficient scientific determination and investment. The project that had started as a small experiment by a geothermal power plant in Iceland had demonstrated technologies that could help stabilize the global climate. The implications extended far beyond climate change. The same geological processes that powered carbon mineralization could potentially be used to permanently store other industrial wastes. Research began on using basalt formations to safely dispose of radioactive materials, toxic heavy metals, and other environmental contaminants that currently lacked permanent disposal solutions. CarbFix had also demonstrated the power of international scientific collaboration. The project involved researchers from Iceland, the United Kingdom, the United States, and eventually dozens of other countries. Knowledge sharing and technology transfer had accelerated development far beyond what any single nation could have achieved alone. The economic transformation was equally remarkable. Iceland's economy, still recovering from the 2008 financial crisis, found new sources of revenue in carbon removal services and technology exports. The country began marketing itself as the world's first carbon-negative nation, attracting green investment and climate-conscious businesses. But the most profound impact was psychological. For years, climate change had seemed like an insurmountable challenge with no clear technological solutions. CarbFix proved that human ingenuity could develop tools to actively heal the atmosphere, not just reduce future damage. This shift from helplessness to hope energized climate action movements worldwide and convinced skeptical governments that carbon removal was technically feasible. The numbers by 2024 were staggering in their own right. The combined CarbFix facilities had permanently stored over 500,000 tons of CO2 as solid rock. Monitoring showed zero leakage and no negative environmental impacts. The cost had dropped to competitive levels with other climate technologies, and the potential for massive scaling was becoming clearer every year. International climate finance began flowing toward carbon removal projects. The Green Climate Fund allocated $5 billion specifically for mineralization technologies. Development banks started including carbon storage capacity in their infrastructure investments. Private carbon markets created premium pricing for permanent removal, providing strong economic incentives for continued expansion. The transformation of global climate policy was perhaps the most significant long-term impact. Carbon removal technologies like CarbFix provided a pathway to not just stop climate change, but potentially reverse it. Scientists began discussing scenarios where atmospheric CO2 levels could be reduced to pre-industrial concentrations within 50 to 100 years through large-scale removal efforts. This possibility fundamentally changed the climate debate. Instead of managing inevitable warming, humanity could potentially restore a stable climate system. The question shifted from, how do we adapt to climate change, to how quickly can we remove enough carbon to stabilize the atmosphere? CarbFix had opened a door to climate solutions that seemed impossible just a decade earlier. The project that had started with pumping a few hundred tons of CO2 into Icelandic rock had demonstrated technologies that could ultimately save human civilization from climate catastrophe. By proving that permanent carbon removal was not just possible, but scalable and economically viable, CarbFix had given humanity a fighting chance against climate change. Today, as construction begins on facilities capable of removing millions of tons of CO2 per year, the vision that seemed impossible in 2014 has become the foundation of global climate strategy. What started as Iceland's bold experiment has become humanity's best hope for a stable climate future. The lesson of CarbFix extends far beyond climate technology. It demonstrates that even the most daunting global challenges can be solved when scientific innovation meets determined action. Sometimes, the most important breakthroughs come not from accepting limitations, but from questioning whether those limitations are real. Iceland proved that with the right combination of geology, technology, and vision, it's possible to turn the atmosphere itself into a carbon storage system, one rock formation at a time.